Welcome to the Remembering a Life podcast. I'm your host, Holly Ignatowski, and today we're talking with Tyink and Christine Kortbein, authors of Grief Reimagined, 50 Creative Strategies to Build Resilience. A bit later, we'll talk about how you can win a free copy of this very creative, inspiring book. So welcome, Catherine and Christine. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So let me begin by asking a little bit about you. Now, Christine, first of all, I'll start with you. You come from an art therapy kind of background in the arts. How did you become inspired to work in the grief space and write a book like this?
Yes, you're correct. Art therapy is my background. I also have some experience working in life enrichment with seniors and with hospice. And my inspiration is the passion that I have for how we express ourselves creatively and how novel or creative ideas enhance our life. And Catherine and I had briefly discussed collaborating on a book project, a resource for people in our field and the general public. And I'll let Catherine tell you kind of how it evolved from there.
So as Christine and I were talking, we were talking about how valuable it would be to share each other's stories of self-care, because we were hearing all of these cool things that other people were doing in times of loss. And we thought that grief is different for everybody and everybody expresses grief differently, so how neat it would be to share stories in a creative, artistic way. And that's how the book project got started.
And Catherine, you're a Wisconsin girl like me. As you said, come from a grief counseling background, so it seems intuitive that maybe this would emerge from your life's work. Now, this was obviously a very personal project, not only for the two of you, but for all the people that are featured in this book. How did you find these people and get them to tell their stories?
We both had in mind when we started the project stories that we had read on the internet and had seen or read stories about. But we also just had a call out to some of our friends and family members just to kind of get the ball rolling. And for instance, one story that evolved from there that's included in the book is called Picking Day. And a friend of mine had lost her mother and her dad remarried, and they were downsizing, but they had all these sentimental items. And I'm sure many of the listeners can relate to when a parent dies, a grandparent, someone that's been around a while, has accumulated a lot of items, and what to do with those items. And so my friend told me this story of how her family, a large family, they all drew names from a hat, and they had what they called Picking Day, where everyone got a chance, according to the number drawn from the hat, to pick an item of sentimental value from the house that they were downsizing. So little by little, stories like these, we started to kind of cultivate and do interviews, and it snowballed from there, because it's kind of like when your attention is set on something, then you see it everywhere. And as soon as we started to collect these stories, we just started finding them one after another, either by referral or we'd find the story, and it sort of just snowballed from there.
Right, and we started writing the book pre-COVID, and once people started quarantining, we just found it pretty accessible to reach people that maybe normally would be out and about. So we have some notable people, writers, actors, singers, lots of different characters in the book too.
I love that each story, it's broken down by stories, has a strategy and an application. It's almost like a how-to guide for grief, because as you said, there's no one-size-fits-all for managing grief. Everybody grieves differently. Some of my favorites I just noted took particular interest in, on page 38, you have baking sadness. Now, baking's my happy place. Loss can come in many forms, not necessarily just the loss of a loved one, but events in our lives. And this family started baking their sadness. Can you talk about that?
Sure. That was one that I had interviewed and wrote about. And yeah, so this family was a military family, and they moved a lot. And so every time you move, sometimes people think of grief and loss just as when someone dies, but moving can be a significant loss too, because you have to say goodbye not only to the friends that you met there, but the places, restaurants, favorites, the school, your neighborhood, lots of things. And so there is a lot of sadness around there. And as a ritual, between the very frequent moves that they moved about every 2 years. The first place in the house they would set up is the kitchen, and they would spend all day baking. And so you have secondary activity of baking, but the primary or the most important thing was baking the sadness and talking about what are they going to miss, and then also moving into what are they going to look forward to. And so that resulted in, of course, some really gorgeous treats, too, that they could share with their new neighbors and start assimilating in their new space.
In reference to the pandemic we just mentioned, I noticed there were, I would imagine, some more strategies came through from the pandemic as well. In particular, the wind telephone. That was very interesting to me, and the application was for sudden death, like a pandemic, when we can't say goodbye and closure isn't possible. Tell us a little bit about the wind telephone.
Yeah, the wind phone was actually a documentary and a featured story on National Public Radio, and it featured a man in Japan when, I think it was 2014, a tsunami hit the island and devastated his town, and many people were lost. He had a beautiful garden, and he happened to find this tiny telephone booth, and he just on a whim put a phone in the booth and decided he wanted to make calls to the departed that had lost. And word got around the town, and other people would come to this little booth to call relatives because he felt that his words were being sent out on the wind, that even though it wasn't actually connected to anything, he found solace in the whole process of his words just being sent out to the spirit through the wind. And it's such a touching story that it's inspired other people to do this. I just recently saw a story about in a forest, I think it was a state park somewhere, maybe Catherine sent that to me, about someone just attached a phone onto a tree out in the forest so you could do the same thing and use the phone as a conduit to spread your words through the wind.
That is a fascinating visual. I love that. And also timely is the coronavirus rhapsody. We all know that laughter is very good medicine, and this was from a Boston comedian who channeled his grief with a reimagined, if you will, version of Bohemian Rhapsody.
Yes, that was Dana J. Bain, who was sitting in his downtown Boston apartment under a pretty strict quarantine, and he had kind of the sniffles, and that resulted in putting some different words to the Bohemian Rhapsody called the Coronavirus Rhapsody. Now it's been viewed by over 100 million people, and it was really interesting interviewing Dana because he talked about how for himself, you know, his go-to strategy is humor, and to find humor in things that are really difficult is his way of coping. And that really resonates, obviously, with a lot of people to have so many listeners of the song. But I think that's a great example, Holly, of how different things work for different people. Some people don't find humor in their expression of loss, and others do. And so that's really a good example of the book, too, and our philosophy behind the book is that not everything's going to work for everybody. So just try some things on, try some of the strategies, and see what could work for you.
Right. It's a personal experience for everyone, for sure. Now, your book is called Grief Reimagined, 50 Creative Strategies to Build Resilience. What exactly does it mean to reimagine our grief? Don't we all just want to kind of get over it and get past it? Why would we want to reimagine it?
Right. Well, I think that's a common myth that grief, which is just the emotion that comes from the loss that happens in our life, and the typical prescription is, you know, diet, exercise, sleep, all of the typical things that we should do to keep ourselves healthy. It may be added in also to, you know, maintain connections with people or attend therapy or groups to process your loss. And people think that they'll get over it, but what has been highlighted by others, people studying grief, is that there is a sixth stage of loss. We may be familiar with the 5 stages of loss, of denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance, but that the 6th stage is finding meaning. And that's one of the common themes through all of the 50 strategies we have, is that finding meaning is a way to process this loss. And the way to do it is finding creative ways to do it can really help find your meaning, because we all like to be resilient. It makes our life much easier. And some people might think, well, we have a character trait that some people are more resilient than others. But really, resiliency is something you cultivate, and it's an opportunity in grief to find that profound personal growth in the moment of grief.
Right. We've even coined that post-traumatic growth and seeing that loss presents us with a chance to be challenged and an opportunity to get to know ourselves better and internally grow versus just getting over it, that we embrace it. It becomes a part of us and our stories.
Is that what you mean by being resilient as we grieve?
That's exactly right, that we grow versus we become less than. I believe it's a hopeful message, and that's our intention, is to provide some hope and inspiration. And we have gotten a lot of great feedback from readers that have used it for that purpose, to build resilience, make themselves stronger.
This theme seems to come up a lot in this podcast that we do. What role does talking about our grief, telling stories, writing about it, how does that play a role in being resilient?
The genesis of our being is to be storytellers. If you think back to cave paintings, or even Bible stories, movies, books that we read, the way that we tell our narrative is through stories. And so by relaying these stories, we're continuing the past with the present. And I always like the Mexican tradition of the 3 deaths, where they talk about the first death, when our body either realizes its own mortality or it literally ceases to function. And the second death is when the body's lowered into the ground and it's out of sight. But the third death is when there's no one left alive to say our name or remember us. And when we're telling our stories, it keeps that third death from approaching in the Mexican tradition. And one of our stories in the book that is about making an altar carries on the Mexican tradition of creating an altar to carry on the stories and the past from the person that we may have loved that we've lost.
As a way of keeping that person alive in our hearts and minds as well.
Right.
As I read the book, it was pretty clear that this was a collaborative process between the two of you. What did you learn about each other and maybe your own resilience when dealing with grief?
Well, for me, personally, engaging in the creative writing process was an effective strategy to overcome the feelings that I was having, as my life was pretty uprooted during the pandemic. And writing in itself was exciting and emotionally gratifying. And it helped me more easily move forward. And then all the social support that we had with each other as we were just collaborating on the project was really healing and helpful to me. I think anything you do to take action when you have a big change in your life is so purposeful and healthy. So instead of ruminating on what was lost, to be taking action and moving forward it's not a letting go or a giving up. It's kind of a bringing in that loss and responding to it with some positive motion or action forward.
Yeah, and I would say that this collaborative process of writing this book can be related to the process of loss, and the fact that sometimes when we're in the throes of grief, we tend to withdraw. And the ability to have another person there for you, to reach out to another person, can give you the confidence to tackle projects. And that's what this book was like. By having Catherine as a collaborator with me, whenever you're experiencing something that's difficult, to have someone else to go through, you can take turns being each other's cheerleader. And I would encourage people that are out there who are either caregivers or maybe supporting a person in grief right there to not to give up on the person, that if there's no response, to just stand there like a sentry awaiting, because there will be a time when that person will emerge from their grief and need that confidence and want some support from you. And that's what it felt like writing this book, as if we got stuck, or if there was an area that was trouble for me, Catherine was there to give me the confidence to keep going, and hopefully I did that for her. And I also realized that resilience is a continuous process, that when we're going through grief, because my mother actually passed away during the process of writing this book, and we gave a dedication in the beginning of the book. She was a voracious reader and would have loved to have seen this book come to fruition. But I realized that it was in the everyday moments that the grief would come, just sort of a light on you, and that it's not just ever anything you just get over, but learn to incorporate in your life. And that's why the collaboration on this project kind of gave me the confidence to keep working through that grief.
Was it hard to write the book, or did you find it easier than you thought to gather all of these stories?
I think what Christine and I both brought to the project was that we're very curious people, and so I think the interviewing, and once we got going, it was hard, but hard in a good way, and very satisfying to be the conduit to share other people's experiences, and knowing that we could be a resource for caregivers, for professionals, and just for everyday people experiencing loss.
And I really appreciated the vulnerability that all of our contributors, that they were willing to share their stories, and some are lighter stories than others, but to be able to put their story out there for others to get some insight on was very revealing for me.
Did either or both of you contribute a strategy in this book?
Yes, we both did. I have a story in the book of how my family, we were living in Australia, and my son was born there, and it became a very special place for us. We were there about a year with my husband's work, and when it came time to leave, we planted a time capsule. And so it was just a way that we could talk to the kids, even though they were quite young, just babies, but they still could participate. And we buried the time capsule, little special things that were reminders of our year in Australia. And when we came back to the United States, to Wisconsin, we took the boys 10 years later and we dug up the time capsule. And so I shared that story of an example of what other people might want to try to do when you're saying goodbye or you're leaving a place that's special to you. So that's one of my stories in the book.
Yep. And I contributed a story. It's called Relaxed Focus. And the origin of that story was I was working in a jail setting, a county jail, and realized that all of the inmates I was working with had extended trauma, from childhood, and needed some activity that would help them find mindfulness. But it wouldn't serve them to sit on a cushion to meditate. So I happened to be looking up mindful activities, and through the rabbit hole of the internet came across something called Zentangles. And it was the early stages of Zentangles as becoming sort of an art cultural phenomenon. It's very prevalent now. There's all kinds of hobbyists and artists who have taken part in this. It's kind of a meditative drawing process. But I took the Zentangles and learned to become certified to teach Zentangles, and in the process found how meditative it was for myself. So have used that as a process in my own grief for finding flow, finding a meditative, sort of an active meditation is what Zentangles is. And so I share that story in the book.
Grief can be so emotional and overwhelming. And when someone we love is experiencing grief, we often don't know what to do. We don't know what to say. And that usually turns into, bringing over some lasagna or food at the doorstep. How would you recommend using this book for someone who is grieving?
I think based on what our readers have told us, they have found it just helpful to be able to have this book as another option to offer people. And I've seen couples. So, for example, I have a friend that she is dealing with a major health issue, and it's really weakened her body. And so her husband reads her a different story from the book every night as a way to have an activity together and something that she can do. They're short reads. They're just 2 pages each. So it's a short read, and persons with health challenges have found that nice because it can be done in a small amount of time. Or people grieving the loss of their spouse have received the book as a gift or bought it for themselves, and they find it helpful because oftentimes when you're in the throes of grief, your attention span isn't super long, and so it's just the right amount of of reading, and that was part of our vision in creating it this way, so that it wouldn't be too overwhelming for anybody, no matter what stage of loss they were experiencing in that moment. So I think just giving the book is a great example. Christine also referred to the idea of just being there, and I thought she made a beautiful analogy of, standing there and being present is a gift too.
And where can we find the book? Where is it available?
The book is on sites such as Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Also, if you want to support your independent, we have various independent bookstores in and around La Crosse area, but if you're more local to Milwaukee, you can go to indiebound.org, and your independent book retailer can purchase the book through there. But if you want to go to ChristineKortbein.com, which is my name, which you'll be able to find if you just Google it, that we actually printed books locally in La Crosse and have them for sale on my website. And this is the kind of the premier version of the book. So it has super thick paper and really rich colors. So if you'd like to get the really rich, vibrant version of the book, you can go through ChristineKortbein.com. Otherwise, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, major retailers, or your independent bookstore would have the book. Just look up by the title.
Wonderful.
They can use a coupon, Grief 2021, at checkout at ChristineKortbein.com. We'll give them 20% off. So anyone that's listening to the podcast, they just type in Grief 2021 when they check out, and they automatically get 20% off.
Wonderful. And I have to ask, because I ask all of my guests, and I'll start with you, Christine. Who are you remembering today?
I am remembering my mother, who passed away April 26th of 2020. She, as I mentioned earlier, she was a voracious reader and would have loved to have seen this book come to fruition, but we do have a wonderful dedication in the front of the book to her.
Catherine?
I'm remembering a friend of mine who passed away 30 years ago, and he is also featured in the book under Peace Poem. That's who I'm remembering. So when you bring people into your life that you've lost, it still feels like he's very much with me, even though it's been 30 years now.
Well, thank you for sharing that.
No, one thing I'll add is one great, I loved about my mother that she always said when talking about getting kids to learn to read, which she would say, don't get the kids hooked on reading, get them hooked on stories. And I think that's true for adults, too. We all love a good story. And that's why in this book, if anything, even if you don't want to read it for the grief part of it, the stories are just wonderful stories of creativity and novel ideas. So part of the book can just be the enjoyment of all the stories included.
Well, thank you, Christine Kortbein and Catherine Tyink, for Grief Reimagined, 50 Creative Strategies to Build Resilience. And thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us today. To learn more about grief resources, visit rememberingalife.com. And to enter our drawing for a copy of our guest's book, Grief Reimagined, 50 Creative Strategies to Build Resilience, visit rememberingalife.com/giveaways.